January 1945, Western Germany. Winter sits heavy on the land, pressing frost into the soil and silence into the ruined villages along the Rhine. Snow clings to broken fences and the blackened shells of farmhouses. In a captured field depot, wooden crates are stacked higher than a man can reach, their stencil markings half buried under ice and mud. When they are opened, the smell travels first: bread, coffee, preserved meat, not the thin rations of collapsing Reich, but food in quantities that feel unreal. German soldiers, exhausted and hollowed by months of retreat, stand nearby under guard. They have crossed the continent fighting shortages. Fuel counted by the liter, ammunition rationed by the day, meals measured by survival rather than hunger. They were taught this enemy would crack first, that democracies could not endure scarcity, that blockades decide wars. But here, far from American cities and factories, the supplies keep arriving, trucks idle in long lines. New crates replace the empty ones without ceremony. There is no urgency in the movement, only routine. In this quiet moment, amid snow and surrender, a realization begins to form, not about defeat on the battlefield, but about something deeper, a truth that no strategy of starvation can undo, and it carries the weight of inevitability as heavy as winter itself. By the time that winter settled over Germany, the war had already revealed its underlying shape. For German planners, it was never meant to be a contest of sheer production. It was designed as a war of exhaustion, of pressure, blockade, and collapse. This belief had roots far deeper than the Third Reich. It was born in the memory of the First World War, when Germany's civilian population slowly starved under Allied naval blockade. Between 1914 and 1918, food shortages had killed hundreds of thousands. Bread became scarce. Meat vanished. Morale eroded long before armies broke. In German strategic thinking, that lesson hardened into doctrine. Modern wars were won not only by armies, but by hunger. When Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany was already preparing for this reality. The regime spoke openly of autarky, economic self-sufficiency, as a weapon of survival. Synthetic fuel plants were built to replace oil imports. Artificial rubber replaced natural supplies Germany did not possess. Rationing systems were designed before the first shots were fired. The German state assumed scarcity as a constant, something to be endured, managed, and weaponized against others. Hardship, they believed, favored discipline. Democracies, by contrast, were seen as fragile, too dependent on comfort, too divided to withstand deprivation. This assumption shaped the opening years of the Second World War. Germany struck quickly, not merely to conquer territory, but to seize resources: grain from Ukraine, oil from Romania, industry from France. Blitzkrieg was not only a military method, it was an economic one. Short wars, rapid victories, minimal strain. The longer a conflict dragged on, the more Germany's structural weaknesses would surface. At sea, this philosophy took its most aggressive form. German U-boat commanders were tasked with strangling Britain into submission. Merchant ships were sunk not for tactical advantage alone, but to deny food. Admiral Karl Dönitz was explicit. Britain, dependent on imports, could be starved into surrender. If shipping losses exceeded construction, morale would follow cargo to the ocean floor. This was the same logic Germany would later apply to the United States, an assumption that distance, isolationism, and political division would limit American endurance. Even after America entered the war in December 1941, German intelligence remained confident. Reports underestimated U.S. industrial capacity. American society was seen as wasteful, inefficient, distracted by consumer comforts. Nazi propaganda portrayed the United States as a nation of excess without discipline, a country incapable of sustaining sacrifice once casualties mounted and luxuries disappeared. The belief was not marginal. It was institutional. Inside Germany, scarcity became the norm. By 1942, civilian rations were shrinking. Meat was replaced with substitutes. Coffee disappeared, replaced by bitter mixtures of roasted grain. Soap, fuel, and clothing were recycled endlessly. On the Eastern Front, soldiers lived on reduced field rations, often dependent on what could be taken from the land or seized from civilians. Hunger followed the Wehrmacht eastward and westward alike. It was brutal, But it was familiar. This familiarity reinforced belief. If Germany could endure hunger and still fight, surely others would collapse sooner. The war, they assumed, would be decided by who broke first under deprivation. Bombs could destroy cities. Blockades could destroy nations. What German planners failed to grasp was that scarcity was not universal. That hardship was not the only organizing principle of modern warfare. Across the Atlantic, a different logic was taking shape. One that treated abundance not as weakness, but as power. A system that did not ration belief in victory, but multiplied it through production. By the time German soldiers stood before American supply depots in 1944 and 1945, the assumptions of two wars, past and present, were colliding. And the collision did not begin with tanks or artillery, but with something far quieter. Something measured not in shells or strategy, but in calories, crates, and consistency. When the United States entered the war, it did so without the instinct of scarcity that had shaped European strategy for decades. December 1941 did not trigger rationing first. It triggered expansion. Factories that had produced automobiles, refrigerators, and farm equipment were converted not by dismantling abundance, but by redirecting it. Assembly lines lengthened. Shifts multiplied. Where European economies tightened, America widened. President Franklin Roosevelt's description of the United States as the arsenal of democracy was not metaphorical. It was literal policy. In 1942 alone, American shipyards launched more vessels than the Axis powers could sink. Liberty ships were assembled in weeks, sometimes days, using standardized parts and unskilled labor trained at speed. Aircraft factories turned out bombers and fighters in numbers that defied pre-war estimates. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's total industrial output. German intelligence struggled to interpret this scale. Reports filtered back through neutral observers and intercepted data, but they were often dismissed as exaggerations. The assumption remained that quantity would come at the expense of quality, that American equipment would be fragile, its soldiers soft, its supply chains vulnerable to disruption. The U-boat campaign against American shipping in 1942 was meant to prove this. Along the U.S. East Coast, tankers burned within sight of shore. Losses mounted. For a brief moment, German commanders believed a familiar pattern was repeating. It did not. Instead of contraction, American production accelerated. Ship losses were absorbed. Rail networks expanded inland. New ports were built. Warehouses multiplied. The American logistical system was not centralized in a single vulnerable artery. It was distributed, redundant, and buffered by geography. Oil flowed from domestic fields. Grain moved from the Midwest. Steel came from plants untouched by bombing. The war did not strain the system into collapse. It activated reserves that had never been fully tapped. Food, in particular, became a defining contrast. While Europe rationed bread by weight and calories by necessity, American forces were supplied with standardized rations designed not merely to sustain life, but to maintain morale. C rations, K rations, and later field kitchens delivered meat, coffee, sugar, chocolate. These were not luxuries in American doctrine. They were tools. A fed soldier, planners believed, fought longer, moved faster, endured more. This abundance followed American troops wherever they landed, in North Africa, in Italy, across France after D-Day. Each beachhead expanded into a logistical footprint that dwarfed local infrastructure. Temporary ports became permanent arteries. Roads filled with convoys that did not stop at night. Fuel depots appeared where villages once stood. And behind the front lines, supply dumps accumulated not just what was needed today, but what would be needed weeks ahead. German soldiers encountered this gradually at first. Captured rations taken from fallen enemies. Overrun depots abandoned in rapid retreats. Then, increasingly through captivity. By 1943 and 1944, tens of thousands of German prisoners were transported to camps in Britain, North Africa, and the United States itself. There, the contrast became impossible to ignore. POWs were fed according to the same caloric standards as American troops. This was not generosity. It was regulation, guided by international law and enforced by supply confidence. Bread was white. Portions were consistent. Coffee was real. Meat appeared regularly. For men who had lived on thinning rations and substitutes, the experience was disorienting. Hunger, which had been assumed universal, was absent. It was here, away from propaganda, away from command structures, that the realization began to settle, not as a sudden revelation, but as accumulation. Day after day, meal after meal, shipment after shipment, the war they had been taught would be decided by starvation was being fought by a nation that did not seem to know the limits of supply. And as the Western Front collapsed and American armies pushed deeper into Germany, that same abundance followed them, rolling forward on tires, humming in engines, stacking itself quietly in fields and forests. The logic of scarcity, so central to German strategy, was no longer theoretical. It was being disproven in real time. The next stage of that realization would not come from observation alone, but from perspective, seen through different lenses of war, each revealing another layer of what abundance truly meant. The first angle was human, and it unfolded slowly without spectacle. German soldiers had been conditioned to equate hardship with strength. Endurance was virtue. Hunger was proof of commitment. From training through combat, deprivation had been normalized. Yet in American captivity, hardship was replaced by routine sufficiency. Meals arrived on schedule. Portions were measured, but not minimal. The body, long accustomed to scarcity, began to adjust. Weight returned. Fatigue eased. What unsettled many prisoners was not kindness, but consistency. There was no improvisation, no sudden shortage. The system did not depend on circumstance. It functioned whether the front advanced or retreated. This consistency challenged belief more than any propaganda leaflet could. If abundance was sustainable even for the enemy's captives, then it was structural, not temporary. Letters from prisoners, censored but factual, hinted at this reality. They spoke of regular meals, of bread that did not change in texture or taste, of coffee that remained coffee. These observations were not ideological, they were physical. They undermined years of instruction that equated democracy with weakness. The second angle was tactical. American operations were planned around supply certainty. Units advanced with the expectation that food, fuel, and ammunition would follow. When roads were destroyed, alternatives appeared. When bridges were blown, engineers replaced them in hours. German units, by contrast, increasingly planned around absence. Fuel shortages dictating movement, ammunition rationing shaping engagement. Battles were lost not always by firepower, but by exhaustion of logistics. Against an enemy that did not slow when supplies were threatened, traditional attrition lost its edge. Food again revealed the difference. American infantry could remain in the field longer without foraging. German units increasingly relied on requisition or seizure, straining relations with civilians and degrading discipline. Hunger narrowed attention. It shortened endurance. It eroded cohesion. Meanwhile, American soldiers carried surplus, sometimes discarding rations not because they were unwanted, but because they were replaceable. The symbolic gap widened with every mile. The third angle was technological, embedded in systems rather than weapons. Refrigeration, packaging, and transport turned food into a stable commodity rather than a fragile necessity. Canned meat could travel oceans. Powdered coffee survived moisture. Bread was wrapped, preserved, standardized. This technology transformed nourishment into a logistical constant. For German soldiers used improvisation and substitutes. This predictability felt unnatural. It suggested a war fought by planning rather than endurance alone. The fourth angle was leadership. German officers on the Western Front reported the scale of American supply with growing urgency. Captured depots contained weeks, sometimes months, of material. Reports described fuel reserves beyond immediate need, ammunition stacked without concealment, food stored in quantities that implied confidence rather than fear. These were not errors. They were deliberate buffers. Leadership began to recognize that starvation strategies no longer applied. The enemy did not live on the edge of depletion. The fifth angle was moral, though it was rarely named as such. Abundance altered behavior. Prisoners who were fed did not riot. Occupied populations who saw surplus did not believe claims of imminent Allied collapse. American supply convoys became moving symbols, visible and repetitive. They did not inspire all through display, but through persistence. Day after day, the same trucks passed, the same crates arrived, the same meals were served. Together, these angles converge on a single realization. This war was not being fought on the same terms as the last. Scarcity was no longer the universal condition. The enemy's strength did not lie in sacrifice alone, but in a system designed to prevent deprivation altogether. That realization, once formed, demanded confrontation with its full consequences. And those consequences would become unavoidable at the moment when retreat turned into collapse and observation turned into certainty. The sixth angle emerged not from the front lines, but from numbers, quiet, impersonal, and devastating in their clarity. German analysts began compiling production statistics as the war turned against them. Aircraft counts, ship tonnage, fuel output. Even when adjusted downward to account for suspected exaggeration, the figures remained overwhelming. American factories were not merely replacing losses. They were expanding faster than the war could consume their output. This was not a surge. It was a sustained condition. Intelligence officers noted a pattern that defied previous models of warfare. Bombing raids, which crippled German industry, had no equivalent effect across the Atlantic. American production sites were beyond reach. Their power grid remained intact. Their transport networks functioned without interruption. The industrial war, once expected to mirror the attritional grind of Europe, revealed an asymmetry that no tactical success could offset. Every destroyed American tank was statistically irrelevant. Another already existed. The seventh angle was geographic. Distance, once considered America's weakness, had become its shield. Oceans absorbed losses. Ports multiplied. Inland factories operated without blackout or ration electricity. German soldiers encountering American supply in Europe were not seeing the entirety of it, only the overflow. What arrived at the front was surplus filtered through layers of redundancy. The real system remained untouched thousands of miles away. The eighth angle was psychological, and it unfolded in silence. German soldiers stopped asking when American supplies would run out. The question no longer made sense. Instead, they wondered how long Germany could continue with less. Hunger sharpened this comparison. At home, families survived on shrinking rations. At the front, soldiers shared substitutes and improvised meals. In captivity or retreat, they watched abundance function without strain. The contrast did not produce admiration. It produced inevitability. Food remained a constant marker. In camps, in depots, and field kitchens, it appeared with mechanical regularity, not as reward, not as propaganda, as process. German prisoners began to mark time by meals rather than rumors. Bread arrived in the same form. Coffee tasted the same each day. The repetition was the message. Systems that can repeat do not collapse suddenly. The ninth angle was ideological. Scarcity had been framed as moral superiority. Discipline through deprivation. Strength proven by endurance. American abundance contradicted this worldview without argument. It suggested that freedom did not require suffering to sustain itself, that organization and choice could replace coercion. German soldiers, stripped of certainty, faced a quiet ideological defeat before the war formally ended. The 10th angle came at the edge of surrender. In 1945, as American forces advanced into Germany, supply followed seamlessly. Towns barely secure were already receiving food distributions. Field kitchens appeared within hours. Civilians, themselves starved, saw the same crates that fed soldiers. Abundance crossed the line between military necessity and civilian relief without hesitation. For German troops witnessing this, the conclusion was unavoidable. This was not a temporary wartime excess. It was a visible expression of a system built to outlast conflict. By the time the front collapsed into disorganized retreat, the realization had hardened. The war had not been lost because Germany lacked courage or discipline. It had been lost because its central assumption was wrong. Starvation could not defeat an enemy who did not depend on scarcity. That truth would reach its clearest form not in theory or report, but in the final phase of the war, when defeat ceased to be reversible and abundance became undeniable. March 1945. The Western Front no longer resembled a line. It was a broad zone of collapse, stretching from the Rhine to the heart of Germany. American units advanced with a confidence that came not only from firepower, but from certainty. Fuel trucks moved behind armored columns without pause. Field kitchens followed infantry within hours. Temporary bridges appeared where rivers had been meant to delay pursuit. The war's decisive moment was not marked by a single battle, but by a condition that could no longer be reversed. As American forces crossed the Rhine, German resistance fragmented. Units fought, but without coordination. Fuel shortages immobilized armor. Ammunition was conserved to the point of paralysis. Soldiers marched on empty stomachs, their movements dictated by the search for food as much as by orders. Against them came formations that did not slow. The supply rhythm remained unchanged regardless of terrain or opposition. This was not momentum. It was system. Captured supply depots along the Rhine revealed the full scale of American logistics. Rows of crates extended beyond sight. Fuel reserves exceeded immediate operational needs. Food stocks were measured in weeks. German officers examining these depots understood what they represented. These supplies had not been rushed forward in desperation. They were part of the schedule. Replacements were already en route. Even destruction could not erase the surplus. For German soldiers taken prisoner during this phase, the experience crystallized. Marching into captivity, they passed convoys moving in the opposite direction. Fresh units, new equipment, additional food. There was no sign of depletion. The war's final months, once expected to strain the enemy to breaking, instead revealed the opposite. American forces appeared to grow stronger as Germany weakened. In prisoner processing areas, food again marked a turning point. Meals were issued immediately. Bread, meat, coffee. The body registered what the mind resisted. Hunger faded. The absence of scarcity felt unnatural after years of deprivation. For many, this was the moment when belief collapsed. Not belief in victory, but belief in the premise that starvation was decisive. The enemy did not ration confidence. It multiplied it. German command reports from this period reflect a subdued tone. The language of attrition disappears, replaced by resignation. There are acknowledgments of industrial disparity, of logistical superiority beyond contest. The strategy that had once promised victory through endurance now offered no explanation for defeat. As cities fell and resistance disintegrated, American supply operations expanded into civilian relief. Food distribution began almost immediately. The same system that sustained armies sustained populations. For German soldiers watching from captivity or retreat, the implication was clear. Abundance was not a temporary wartime anomaly. It was a foundation of the enemy's strength. This realization, formed through observation and confirmed by experience, marked a true turning point. Not when the last bridge fell or the last order was given, but when the logic of scarcity collapsed under the weight of evidence. By April 1945, the war had become a matter of days, not months. What remained was not strategy, but confirmation. German units surrendered in groups, then in columns, often without firing a shot. The reasons recorded were consistent. No fuel, no food, no ammunition, no expectation of relief. These were not failures of courage. They were failures of assumption. The enemy had not been weakened by time. It had been reinforced by it. As American forces advanced deeper into Germany, supply lines lengthened without thinning. The same trucks that had crossed France now moved through the Ruhr and into Bavaria. Railheads were repaired and repurposed within hours of capture. Field depots appeared in forests, factories, and schoolyards. Nothing suggested a system nearing exhaustion. The war's final movement revealed the ultimate imbalance. Germany was fighting the limits of its own endurance against an enemy that had not yet reached its own. Production figures, compiled even as the Reich collapsed, told the same story. In 1944, American factories produced tens of thousands of aircraft, ships, and armored vehicles, numbers that exceeded losses many times over. Food production remained untouched by bombing. Civilian consumption continued alongside military supply. There was no transfer of scarcity from front to home. The economy absorbed war rather than surrendering to it. For German soldiers, this was a definitive moment. The belief that America would fracture under strain was no longer defensible. The United States had not been starved. It had not been isolated. It had not been exhausted. The strategy that had haunted German memory since 1918, victory through blockade, had failed completely. Scarcity had not crossed the Atlantic. Food, the simplest measure, remained constant to the end. POW camps continued issuing full rations even as fighting intensified nearby. Civilians in newly occupied areas received emergency supplies. The system functioned without pause. There was no final rationing, no visible tightening. The war ended without the enemy ever appearing hungry. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the conclusion was unavoidable. The war had not been lost at the moment of defeat, but at the moment its core assumption was proven false. You cannot starve a nation that produces beyond its needs. You cannot blockade an economy designed to expand under pressure. What German soldiers realized in those final months was not simply that they had lost. It was that the war had been unwinnable on its own terms. Abundance had rendered starvation obsolete. The consequences of that realization would not end with surrender. They would shape memory, policy, and ideology in the years that followed, long after the last convoy moved and the last ration card expired. In the weeks following surrender, the contrast did not fade. It intensified. German prisoners remained in American custody as Europe struggled to recover. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure was shattered. Food shortages worsened across the continent. Yet inside the camps, the system continued. Rations remained stable. Medical care expanded. Work details were organized around nutrition and recovery for men returning from years of deprivation. The difference was not theoretical. It was embodied. Reports from this period document steady weight gain among prisoners. Disease rates declined. Mortality fell sharply compared to conditions at the war's end within Germany itself. These outcomes were not exceptional acts of mercy. They were the result of a logistical doctrine that treated human maintenance as essential rather than optional. The system that fed armies fed prisoners with equal predictability. German officers, separated from command but not from reflection, began to reassess the war's premises. Memoirs and post-war interviews repeatedly returned to the same observation. The scale of American supply was beyond anything anticipated. Many describe a delayed realization that the war had been lost the moment the United States entered fully, not because of immediate military imbalance, but because the rules had changed. Scarcity no longer governed outcomes. Food continued to serve as the clearest symbol. Former soldiers recalled white bread, fresh meat, real coffee. These memories appear with surprising frequency in post-war accounts, not as indulgence, but as evidence. The presence of abundance where none was expected forced reconsideration of ideological claims made during the war. Discipline without supply had proven insufficient. Endurance without replacement had reached its limit. Beyond the camps, the same logistical machine shifted focus. American supply networks transitioned from combat support to relief operations. Food shipments were redirected to civilians. Temporary kitchens expanded into sustained programs. The process was efficient, almost routine. For Germans witnessing this transformation, the message was unmistakable. The enemy's strength had not depended on destruction alone. It had rested on the capacity to sustain life even after victory. This had psychological consequences that extended beyond individual soldiers. The narrative of collapse through starvation, so central to German strategic thinking, lost credibility. Hunger had broken Germany, but it had not touched America. The asymmetry forced a reassessment of power itself. Victory was no longer defined solely by battlefield success or sacrifice. It was defined by systems that could outlast catastrophe. As Germany entered occupation, the abundance that had once shocked soldiers became visible to civilians. Relief packages arrived. Supply trucks returned. The same crates seen at the front appeared in towns and villages. They were not symbols of conquest. They were symbols of capacity. That capacity, once revealed, demanded explanation. And in the process of explanation, a deeper ideological shift began, one that would shape how the war was remembered and how its lessons were carried forward. By late 1945, the long-term consequences of American logistical superiority were becoming clear. The German military, long trained to rely on rationing as a tool of discipline, now had to reckon with the limits of that philosophy. Hunger, once a weapon, had become irrelevant against an opponent who could sustain not only its armies, but its prisoners and, eventually, liberated populations. POW reports and intelligence analyses repeatedly emphasize this. A German officer later recalled, "We fought a war we thought we understood and discovered our calculations were meaningless against a nation that simply would not run out." Numbers reinforce the impression. By the end of 1945, U.S. industrial output had eclipsed Germany's cumulative production of war material across the entire conflict. Liberty ships, tanks, aircraft, rifles, and ammunition were counted in quantities that German planners could scarcely comprehend. The production pace was relentless. Even losses did not matter because replacements were constant. Every tactical success Germany achieved on the battlefield was offset by a logistical system that could instantly respond. The war was being fought in a domain the German military had never mastered: abundance as strategy. This abundance did not only influence the battlefield, it reshaped perceptions of democracy itself. Soldiers and officers exposed to the system began noting a dissonance. A nation that produced freely, fed even its enemies, and did not collapse under stress could sustain ideological resilience far beyond what authoritarian regimes expected. Bread and coffee, routine rations in American camps, became symbols of an ideology embedded in material capability. Where scarcity had once been associated with strength in German thought, it now appeared as weakness, while the ability to provide and sustain became the ultimate measure of power. Post-war reflections by POWs and observers consistently highlighted these contrasts. One former soldier noted, "We expected to see despair, but instead we saw order. We expected hunger, but instead we found abundance. We have been trained to believe scarcity defines strength, yet the Americans live without it." Historians today corroborate these testimonies with data. U.S. food exports, domestic production, and supply chain efficiency exceeded the combined ability of Axis forces to disrupt or consume. Even in occupied territories, the American logistical footprint ensured that scarcity was largely circumvented. The ideological consequences extended beyond the immediate military outcome. The war had not merely defeated Germany. It had demonstrated that a society capable of sustaining abundance under extreme pressure could outlast one predicated on scarcity and coercion. German soldiers returned home, not only physically restored, but intellectually challenged. Their experience revealed that victory required more than discipline and sacrifice. It required systems designed to perpetuate resilience, to maintain morale, and to deliver certainty where uncertainty was weaponized. This realization also influenced post-war reconstruction and occupation policy. Allies understood that logistics, as much as military action, determined outcomes. American abundance became a tool of stabilization, an instrument of soft power and a moral statement. It was not just that the Axis had failed to starve the U.S., but that the U.S. had proven its capacity to feed itself, its soldiers, its prisoners, and eventually the liberated population, establishing a model for what post-war democracy could sustain. By the time the final POWs returned home, the pattern was unmistakable. German forces had encountered not merely superior weaponry, but a superior system. Scarcity, once a universal constant of war, had been made irrelevant. The consequences were both material and psychological, shaping post-war memory, doctrine, and ideology. In the quiet aftermath, food remained the clearest witness to what had transpired. Bread, meat, coffee, simple, tangible, constant, stood as symbols of a nation whose strength was measured not in suffering endured, but in abundance sustained. German soldiers, once trained to equate hardship with virtue, carried these memories home, perplexed and humbled. The war had not been lost in battle alone. It had been lost in the confrontation between two philosophies: scarcity as power and abundance as strategy. The crates, trucks, and kitchens that had followed the American advance were more than logistics. They were statements of possibility. They declared that freedom could coexist with provision, that an ideology rooted in human capacity could outperform one rooted in constraint. In every meal served to POWs, in every field kitchen that appeared behind advancing lines, a quiet truth was made tangible. A society that can feed itself can endure, resist, and ultimately prevail. Even as Europe rebuilt, the lessons lingered. The United States demonstrated that systems, not coercion alone, shape outcomes. Supply could determine morale. Sustenance could define strategy. A war once thought to be winnable through starvation had revealed its impossibility. And in that revelation lay a broader truth. Abundance, carefully organized and persistently delivered, is not indulgence. It is power. German soldiers returning to a shattered homeland carried both physical and philosophical weight. The war had tested endurance, but it had also tested assumptions. Scarcity, once considered universal, had been rendered irrelevant against a force that knew no pause. The sight, smell, and taste of abundance left impressions that no rhetoric could erase. Bread was no longer merely food. It was a testament. Coffee was no longer merely drink. It was evidence. Meals had become history, and history had become memory. And in memory, the quiet lesson endured. Freedom thrives not only through courage and discipline, but through systems that enable survival, resilience, and the unbroken rhythm of life. The moment German soldiers realized America could not be starved was not simply a military turning point. It was a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity, planning, and the capacity to sustain both army and nation in the face of total war. It was a moment when scarcity yielded to abundance and ideology yielded to reality. A moment that would echo far beyond the frozen fields, over the Rhine, and into the unfolding history of a world forever changed.